Imagine being a child in the 18th century. No toys, no comfort, and a diet that could only be described as a test of endurance. And, just in case that wasn't enough, you were probably dosed with whiskey, soap, or something worse to help you grow up strong and healthy. Curious? Buckle up, because today we're diving into the world of 18th century parenting, where care was a synonym for tough love. Curious? Well, buckle up, because today we're going back to a time where children were treated as miniature adults, safety was a vague concept, and parenting was a mix of science, superstition, and cruelty. If you've ever thought modern parenting was hard, you haven't seen anything yet. But before we get started, a quick hello and welcome to History Lullaby. If this is your first time here, thank you for joining us. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Trust me, it'll help us keep making more of these fascinating videos just for you. All right, now let's get back to it. Picture it, the 1700s. The streets are muddy. The air smells faintly of livestock and smoke. And the children, oh yes, the children aren't allowed to be children, not in any sense we'd recognize today. If you were 5, 6, or 10, congratulations. You were already an apprentice to life itself, a miniature adult with duties, chores, and the constant looming threat of punishment. You didn't get stickers for good behavior. You got stern looks, paddles, or if you were really unlucky, a lingering lecture on the consequences of your very existence. Why? Well, society had a very clear idea. Childhood wasn't precious. It was fleeting. And in the 1700s, time wasn't spent letting children daydream or finger paint. No, every minute was invested in survival, obedience, and productivity. You were expected to fetch water, sweep the floors, scrub the family clothes, and maybe, if you were particularly ambitious or perhaps unlucky, help mind the younger siblings, who themselves were undergoing their own miniature apprenticeship in endurance. Parents, naturally, were under tremendous pressure too. There were bills, there were crops, there was the looming threat of poverty or illness. Children, in this context, weren't little bundles of joy. They were extra hands, extra heads, extra responsibility. And how did parents enforce compliance? Ah, yes, discipline. The kind of discipline that would make modern-day child psychologists faint in horror. Forget gentle suggestions, reasoning, or calm conversations about behavior. In the 1700s, building character meant building obedience, and obedience often came with a side of physical discomfort. Wooden paddles, straps, and belts were the tools of the trade. And not just for the obvious misdeeds like hitting your sibling or spilling the family cat into a river. No, minor infractions, talking back, spilling your porridge, even laughing at an inappropriate time, could earn you a swift, memorable reminder that adults were in charge. And when I say swift, I mean, you'd feel it echo in your memory for decades. Imagine sitting in the corner of a dimly lit room, your legs stiff, your hands folded neatly in front of you, your body quivering because you're trying not to breathe too loudly. And around you, every adult in the room silently judges your existence. Yes, it's like sitting for an eternity in a classroom where the teacher's glare could cause physical pain. This was considered character building. In modern terms, it was more like endurance torture, with a hint of existential despair. And then there were public punishments. Parents sometimes took their lessons outside the home, ensuring that children's mistakes were not just privately noted, but socially recognized. Imagine being forced to stand in the market square, red-faced, for accidentally dropping a loaf of bread. Townsfolk would nod sagely, whisper judgments, and you would feel every bit the cautionary tale. Every minor failure was a lesson, every embarrassment a brick in the foundation of your future adult self. It's hard not to marvel at the sheer efficiency of psychological conditioning in this era. Efficiency, yes. Compassion, questionably. Beyond physical discipline and public humiliation, silence was golden, literally. Children were expected to sit still, speak only when spoken to, and even then, answer in precise, correct terms. Spontaneity was dangerous. Imagination, irrelevant. Emotions were best bottled, lest the wrong feeling escaped your face and drew a rebuke. Joy was suspicious. Sadness was frowned upon. Curiosity was often punished. Keep your head down. Keep your hands to yourself. And above all, keep your thoughts inside your skull. Might as well have been carved above every household door. Let's not forget work. From dawn until dusk, children were expected to contribute meaningfully. They weren't simply playing at chores. They were laborers. Fetching water, tending animals, preparing meals, sewing, spinning wool, or helping in workshops were all considered essential. Children weren't just learning skills. They were keeping the household, and sometimes the family's survival, afloat. Failure to perform meant punishment. Success was often just not being punished. Not exactly inspiring, right? Humor, in some corners of life, became a double-edged sword. Laughing at the wrong moment could get you paddled, but cleverly navigating the absurdity of life finding small moments of rebellion without being caught was the early form of resilience. Children learned to read adults like books, when to speak, when to nod, when to hide a grin. Social intelligence became as important as practical skill. Surviving was as much about cunning as it was about compliance. The intensity of this no-nonsense upbringing was also tied to rigid societal norms. Boys were expected to display industriousness, physical endurance, and obedience. Girls were trained in domestic skills, poise, and the social arts. The common thread? Every child was shaped, molded, and sometimes scarred in preparation for the adult world. A world where survival depended on wit, endurance, and the ability to anticipate the whims of those above you in social or familial hierarchy. Now, it wasn't all pure brutality. Some parents, perhaps through desperation or curiosity, experimented with early forms of child-rearing advice. Books existed, written by morally upright, occasionally terrifying authors, with titles like The Complete Guide to Training Your Child for Labor, Obedience, and Eternal Respectability. These tomes were read aloud, often while the child listened quietly, or quietly suffered learning the proper posture for penance, the correct way to fold hands in shame, and the spiritually approved angles for sitting still without complaint. Even food and sleep were tools of discipline. Children were rationed not just for sustenance, but for moral fortitude. The meals were plain. Beds were uncomfortable. Overindulgence, even in rest or food, was considered a threat to character. And, yes, there were the infamous treatments for health or behavioral issues, whiskey, cold baths, and other tough love remedies designed to make you strong, or make you wish you were invisible. The environment was harsh, the rules strict, and the margin for error slim. And yet, somehow, children adapted. They learned the delicate art of survival, obedience, subtle defiance, and strategic silence. Every successfully navigated misstep was a minor victory. Every hour without punishment, a triumph. It was like a prolonged, never-ending game of strategy where the opponent was omnipresent and extremely judgmental. Humor, when allowed, was often subversive. A child might glance at a sibling with a wink, quietly defy an absurd order, or cleverly misinterpret instructions. These small acts of rebellion became stories passed among children, whispered in corners while adults discussed matters of greater importance. Survival wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about mental agility, emotional restraint, and the ability to keep your sense of self intact in a world that demanded conformity. So, as you sit there, perhaps in a modern cushioned chair, sipping something safe and sugary, reflect for a moment on your 1700s counterpart. That tiny, linen-wrapped human, sitting stiffly under the weight of expectation, dodging paddles, enduring public humiliation, and yet somehow surviving, thriving, and learning. Imagine sitting silently for hours while every adult silently judges your existence. Welcome to character building 18th century style. In short, life for a child in the 1700s was a complex mix of survival, obedience, and tiny victories of cunning. Every day was structured, every action scrutinized, and every misstep potentially punished. But from this harsh environment Resilience was forged. Children grew up fast, learned early how to navigate social and familial power structures, and developed coping strategies that modern parents might struggle to comprehend. It was a world without playgrounds, without playdates, without emotional support as we know it today. Yet somehow, they managed to survive. And that alone is remarkable. All right, strap in, because this is where things get, well, medically questionable. Imagine, if you will, a world where parents genuinely believed that the best way to calm a crying baby was a generous dose of bourbon. Yeah, bourbon. And not the kind that comes with a polite little coaster and a fancy glass. We're talking straight up sip if you're teething level bourbon, often mixed with opium syrup because apparently if one drug isn't enough, why not double down? In the 1700s, soothing syrups were a staple of child rearing. A baby wouldn't just cry for attention. They were in dire need of a curative tonic, one that could both numb the pain of teething and lull them into a dangerously deep nap. Parents, probably exhausted from endless laundry, fetching water, and managing multiple siblings, were grateful for anything that promised peace. And so, these syrupy concoctions found their way into mouths, little drops of chaos disguised as medicine. If a modern parent thinks a sugar-laden lollipop is risky, just picture handing over bourbon and opium syrup to your infant. For science, of course. Now, let's talk about mercury ointments. Because why stop at opium when heavy metal will do the trick? If a child had a rash, cough, or seemingly minor complaint, it wasn't uncommon for a parent or, more often, a local apothecary or physician to prescribe a mercurial ointment. Slather it on generously. And if the child looked a little pale or weak, maybe rub some more on their gums or neck. Mercury was considered magical for health, an almost mystical ingredient that could purge disease and strengthen the body. In reality, it was toxic, potentially leading to tremors, digestive issues, or worse. But hey, at least the child smelled faintly metallic bonus points, right? Then there were the teething necklaces. Oh yes, strings of coral, beads, and sometimes garlic hung around tiny necks, supposedly to ease pain or ward off evil spirits. Imagine a miniature adult, choking on beads, drooling, and still expected to sit quietly for meals. Parents truly believed that these necklaces were a blend of medicine and superstition, merging hygiene, protection, and, honestly, a touch of parental desperation. It's hard not to admire the creativity, even if the execution was questionable. And of course, no discussion of 18th century health practices is complete without vinegar baths. Ah, the vinegar bath. A ritual of cleanliness and moral fortitude. If a child misbehaved, or even just existed in a slightly unhygienic state, they might be dunked into cold water spiked with vinegar. The scent alone could knock an adult off their feet, let alone the child's small body. It was believed that the acid could purify the skin, remove disease, and strengthen the constitution. In reality, it probably just caused screaming, shivering, and a newfound hatred of bathing. Hygiene in general was rough. Children often shared beds with siblings, cousins, or even visiting relatives. Vermin, lice, fleas, and who knows what else were unwelcome but persistent bedfellows. Baths were rare and considered luxurious. Sheets and clothing were changed only when visibly soiled, or when an adult remembered that touching a child's sweat-soaked tunic might be unpleasant. Sharing a bed with a sibling and an insect army wasn't just a rite of passage, it was reality. Feeding time wasn't much better. Meals were often cold, lumpy, or improperly prepared. Nannies, parents, or older siblings would attempt to feed infants porridge or gruel, sometimes sloshed with water or beer to soften it or add a medicinal kick. And if the child protested, a gentle slap or a dash of syrup might follow. Rebellion, even in drooling form, was not tolerated. All of these practices, mercury ointments, opium syrups, vinegar baths, teething, necklaces, were considered standard. And, of course, they were applied liberally. You see, children were tiny adults in the eyes of society, and toughening them up was seen as essential for survival. The logic was simple. The harder the experience in infancy and early childhood, the more resilient the child would become as an adult. You might say it was survival of the fittest, 18th century edition. And yet, the combination of questionable medicines, poor hygiene, and harsh living conditions made survival precarious. Mortality rates were high, and injuries common. A misapplied ointment could blister skin. A mismeasured dose of opium syrup could cause dangerous sedation. Even the most careful parent had to balance desperation, superstition, and hope that the child would survive yet another day. Public health knowledge was rudimentary at best. Germs? Not exactly on the radar. Cross-contamination? Hardly considered. Parents relied on what had been passed down for generations. Recipes, remedies, and rituals that blended folk medicine with whatever scientific understanding was available at the time. The results were unpredictable, often disastrous, but occasionally miraculous, or at least survivable. Humor, when allowed, was the coping mechanism of both parent and child. You might chuckle at the absurdity of it all, giving a baby a slug of bourbon, tying beads around their neck, scrubbing them in vinegar, and then hoping they'd live to tell the tale. And somehow, children did survive, grow, and adapt. Some became resourceful adults, hardened not just by physical challenges, but by an intimate familiarity with life's randomness, danger, and discomfort. Imagine a child waking to the smell of vinegar, the sight of a mercury pot, and a spoonful of syrup waiting for breakfast. They'd hesitate, consider running, then comply, because rebellion could result in a paddle or a lecture that lasted until lunchtime. And lunch? Probably another dose of medicine disguised as food. Survival wasn't just about nutrition. It was about endurance, compliance, and quiet cunning. Parents, for their part, were often exhausted and overworked. They truly believed they were doing the best for their children. The tools at their disposal were crude, the understanding of physiology minimal, and the pressure to raise obedient, capable children immense. So, they did what they could. A little opium here, a little vinegar there, and a strict schedule of obedience to reinforce moral and physical fortitude. Even the best-intentioned caregivers had to improvise. If a child had a fever, a cough, or merely whimpered too much, there was always a tonic, salve, or bizarre charm to try. If the child lived, the parent was praised. If the child died, it was either divine will, bad luck, or blame shifted elsewhere. Life was harsh, parenting harsher, and humor became a lifeline for the family quiet chuckles behind the kitchen door, ironic sighs, and whispered, "Oh, not again," as yet another remedy failed spectacularly. So, as you imagine this tiny human shivering in vinegar, drooling syrup, and sporting a teething necklace of dubious efficacy, remember, this was the everyday reality. Childhood wasn't meant to be easy. It was meant to produce hardy, resilient, obedient little humans, prepared for the rigors of adult life. If you think giving your kid a lollipop is risky, try handing over bourbon and opium syrup for science. By the end of the day, the child might be sticky, sleepy, or slightly poisoned, but probably still alive. Parents would sigh, check the sleeping arrangements, perhaps swat the sibling who peeked at the baby's tonic, and prepare for another day. And so the cycle continued. Whiskey for teething, mercury for skin, vinegar for purification, and children for resilience training. This was the 1700s parenting method in full glory. Harsh, sometimes cruel, occasionally effective, and always terrifyingly inventive. And yet, somehow, a generation survived. They may have been a little wobbly from the syrup, a little scorched from mercury, and very cautious around vinegar baths, but they made it. And in some twisted way, that's the enduring testament to the parents' no-nonsense attitude. Strict, dangerous, and deeply committed to producing obedient, functional, and extraordinarily tough adults. Grab your imaginary spoon because we're about to dig into the daily culinary joys, or, more accurately, the daily culinary torments of children in the 1700s. Back then, food wasn't just nourishment. Oh no, food was a tool. A strict, flavorless, morally instructive tool designed to shape young bodies and even stricter minds. Breakfast, for example, wasn't a cozy moment over cereal or toast. Nope, Your morning meal was likely a bowl of gruel. Yes, gruel. That suspiciously thin, watery porridge that smelled faintly of boiled sadness and dust. Sometimes oats, sometimes barley, sometimes just water pretending to be food. No sugar, no spices, no excitement. You stirred it with a wooden spoon that had seen more abuse than you had in your short life. Every bite was a test. Could your tiny jaw manage to chew and swallow something that could double as a building material? Now let's be clear. Sugar existed. It was not an evil, forbidden substance designed to torture children. No, it was simply a luxury reserved for the very wealthy or for special occasions, like a religious festival, a holiday, or the rare birthday. If you weren't royalty, or your parents weren't fabulously rich, you probably wouldn't see sugar more than once a year. And even then, your portion was about the size of a grain of sand on the Nile. A small, sad grain of sand. Imagine being a child, hungry, chewing tasteless gruel, and watching other kids occasionally sneak a bit of sweet honey or a chunk of fruit. The jealousy alone could stunt your emotional development. Not that it mattered much. Emotional expression was considered frivolous anyway. But stomach rumbling aside, every meal was also a moral lesson. Yes, children were expected to endure flavorless food to build character. Think of it as an early version of boot camp, except for your taste buds. Lunch didn't improve much. It was more grueling. Perhaps some overcooked vegetables bland, fibrous, and unidentifiable. Sometimes a piece of bread, hard as a cobblestone. Maybe with a smear of something vaguely edible, and if you were lucky, maybe a watery soup with the faintest hint of meat. Meat was rare, unless you were wealthy. And even then, portions were symbolic more than filling. Protein? Occasionally. Joy? Almost never. The goal wasn't delicious. The goal was build moral fortitude through enduring flavorlessness. Let's not forget how food was tied to discipline. If a child complained about their gruel, or even worse, left it uneaten, it was considered a sign of moral weakness. Perhaps a mild scolding. Perhaps a reminder with a wooden spoon. Sometimes, they were sent to bed hungry. A warning that life doesn't always hand you things you like. The idea was simple. Suffering builds character, and character builds future citizens who can survive hard times, and perhaps faint at the slightest inconvenience. Water, unfortunately, wasn't much better than the food. Clean water was rare, and children were expected to drink from whatever was available. A bucket, a shared cup, or the local well, which had seen better days, or cleaner ones, decades ago. Hydration? Sure. Enjoyment? Absolutely not. Thirst was another lesson in endurance. Some parents even encouraged warm ale or watered-down beer for young children, the theory being that it was healthier than water. In practice, it was another method of slowly hardening their systems against life's cruelties. Dinner, of course, repeated the pattern. Gruel, perhaps a boiled vegetable, maybe some scraps of meat if the family was feeling generous. And if a child was unlucky enough to have a sibling with better manners, they might even end up with the leftover, slightly spoiled portion. Yet all of this was presented under the guise of moral education. Every meal was a lesson in endurance, resilience, and the grim art of swallowing your disappointments. Quite literally. Nutrition, or the lack thereof, had long-term consequences. Children in the 1700s frequently suffered from rickets, scurvy, and stunted growth, all because their diets lacked essential vitamins. Bone deformities? Check. Weak teeth? Double check. Susceptibility to disease? Triple check. But hey, according to the parents, the purpose was not to pamper. It was to produce hardy, morally upright individuals ready to endure life's hardships without whining. Who needs calcium when you have character, right? Special treats were reserved for festivals. Perhaps a bit of honey, a small sweet, or a rare biscuit. These occasions were the culinary highlight of a child's existence. They provided brief, fleeting glimpses of joy, like tiny suns breaking through the gray clouds of gruel and vinegar. But even these were carefully rationed. Overindulgence was frowned upon. Gluttony was a moral failing. The message was clear. Enjoy sweetness sparingly, lest you become soft, lazy, or morally corrupt. The children, of course, interpreted this differently. The festival sweets were a time for pure, chaotic sugar, joy, ephemeral rebellion against the dull drudgery of daily meals. School meals mirrored this austerity. Often, children were expected to bring their own gruel or bread, or subsist on whatever the schoolmaster deemed sufficient. Lunch breaks were more about endurance than nutrition. A bowl of lukewarm porridge consumed under strict supervision was intended to reinforce obedience. Any complaint could result in punishment, another lecture on the virtues of endurance, or a public display of scolding. One can't talk about diet without mentioning the strange and sometimes hazardous remedies added to food. Parents believed in fortifying children through spices, bitters, and potions mixed into daily meals. A pinch of ground herbs to strengthen the blood, a dash of questionable tonic to boost digestion, or a few drops of mysterious syrup for general vigor. Sometimes, these concoctions were more likely to poison than nourish. And yet, somehow, children survived, albeit with memories of questionable flavors, forever burned into their senses. Even the utensils were austere. Metal spoons, wooden bowls, rough breadboards, nothing soft, comforting, or designed for culinary pleasure. Eating was a utilitarian act, a mechanical process of sustaining life and enduring discipline. Complaints were seen as weakness. Swallowing your gruel silently was a triumph in obedience, a sign of a child who could handle the world. Imagine a child at the dinner table, chewing a lumpy, flavorless gruel while the adults watched silently, judging every bite. Maybe the sibling next to them was enjoying a slightly better portion. Maybe a treat had been smuggled in by a mischievous servant. Either way, the moral lesson remained. Complain, and the wooden spoon may find its mark. Sit quietly, and perhaps, just perhaps, you'll be granted a bit of honey at the next festival. Some parents used meals as punishment. Eat everything, or nothing. Leave a crumb uneaten, and your dinner might be removed entirely. Forget the idea of snacks were for wealthy children, or those who had been deemed obedient. The poor, and often middle-class children, learned early that food was a tool of compliance. Even chewing quietly could be a challenge, as gruel and boiled oats didn't exactly slide down easily. For the very youngest, weaned infants were given porridge or watered-down gruel, sometimes mixed with ale or sweetened syrups, more for calming the child than for nutrition. The idea was that a compliant infant would grow into a disciplined toddler, and eventually, a manageable child. Crying was frowned upon. Sucking too long on a spoon could result in chastisement. Patience, obedience, and endurance were the ultimate goals. In summary, the 1700s diet for children was a careful balance of austerity, moral instruction, and survival. No sugar, no flavor, no comfort, unless earned through obedience. Nutritional deficiencies were widespread. Illness was common. Yet, through this harsh regimen, parents believed they were shaping the next generation into resilient, morally upright adults, able to withstand the trials of life without complaint. And yes, it was as brutal as it sounds. Imagine surviving the day fueled entirely by tasteless gruel, and thinking this counts as parenting. Even in hindsight, it's hard not to marvel at the sheer creativity, albeit terrifying, of 18th century parenting. Gruel, boiled oats, rationed sugar, and moral lectures formed the backbone of a child's daily existence. And, somehow, children survived, grew, and adapted, becoming the adults who, centuries later, could laugh at the absurdity of it all, or at least write about it. Take a deep breath. Maybe grab a warm blanket, because we're about to travel to the classrooms of the 1700s. And by classrooms, I mean rooms where a quiet death of the spirit occurred daily, at least for the average child. School back then was not about fun, creativity, or self-expression. Nope, it was about obedience, memorization, and the slow, methodical teaching of endurance through physical and mental discomfort. Picture this: a row of children, back straight, eyes forward, hands folded neatly in laps, or else. The master, usually a stern, thin man, with the kind of glare that could peel paint, patrols the room like a hawk. Every cough, every twitch, every hesitation is noted, and often punished. Time for a spelling lesson? Rote memorization. Latin verbs? Repeated endlessly until the tongue aches, the jaw cramps, and your mind starts to wander to far more interesting things, like chewing on your own fingernails, disobedience, or even the appearance of distraction, might result in a swift rap on the knuckles, a few lashes with a cane, or a standing punishment at the corner of the room. Sitting still for hours was both a test of endurance and a demonstration of control. Imagine having to remain perfectly silent, perfectly still, while every adult silently judges your existence, parents would say. Or, if they didn't say it, that was certainly the lesson delivered. Welcome to Character Building 1700 style. And yes, the boys and girls did not get the same education. Gender was everything. Boys were sent to learn Latin, Greek, arithmetic, history, and sometimes even philosophy, if they were from a family wealthy enough to pay for it. Their education was designed to produce little men capable of participating in civic life, business, or the clergy. In practice, it often produced exhausted, bruised little scholars who could recite Virgil but couldn't comprehend why their knuckles still throbbed from the morning's caning. Girls, on the other hand, were taught domestic skills, embroidery, etiquette, and the fine art of appearing calm while their every misstep was criticized. And yes, fainting gracefully was apparently an essential skill. Imagine being 12, your hands shaking from threading a needle for the third hour, your older sister silently judging your stitches, and your mother hovering with a ruler, ready to correct your posture, or inflict punishment if you so much as made a flinch. Every embroidered stitch was a lesson in both patience and fear. Boarding schools were the ultimate crucible. Children separated from their families at a young age were expected to adapt quickly or suffer. Homesickness? Not really a valid excuse. Tears were generally met with disdain, sometimes punishment. Meals were uninteresting gruel. Dormitories were cramped, and privacy was a myth. Discipline was everywhere. In the classroom, in the dining hall, and yes, even during play. Every step, every word, every glance was monitored. The teachers themselves were often as cruel as the circumstances allowed. Imagine a man standing 6 feet tall, cane in hand, moving among small children, dishing out punishment for the tiniest infractions. Spoke out of turn? 10 lashes. Missed a Latin declension? 5. Chewed your bread before the prayer? Better believe it's the corner for you. The fear alone kept most children in line, and those who dared to challenge authority often learned very quickly why the system worked. Yet, despite all the brutality, there was some method to the madness, at least in the eyes of the educators. The goal was obedience. The goal was preparation for life's harsh realities. Kids were expected to develop resilience, discipline, and the ability to endure boredom, discomfort, and constant scrutiny. And boy, did they learn quickly. Many students grew up with a permanent mental imprint of fear, self-discipline, and the ability to sit through interminable lectures without so much as a sigh. Homework, if it existed, was equally punishing. Imagine spending hours copying Latin verbs, arithmetic tables, or moral maxims by candlelight, only to have the next day's instructor check every line with the sharp eyes of a hawk. Mistakes were not gently corrected. They were noted, remembered, and sometimes physically reprimanded. No, you may not use this quill incorrectly. It's a moral failing, clearly. But it wasn't all misery. In rare cases, children found ways to navigate the system. Clever boys might memorize only enough to avoid punishment, while secret alliances and whispers could provide slight relief from the daily grind. Girls, meanwhile, developed dexterity and patience that bordered on the superhuman, needles threaded for hours, all under the watchful eye of a superior. That's endurance training for both body and mind. Games existed, yes, but only under strict supervision. And even then, they were considered productive if they reinforced obedience, social hierarchy, or physical fitness. Running in the yard was fine if it was organized and watched. Spontaneous fun often ended with a sharp word, a threat, or worse. Every movement, every decision was a test, and the stakes were high. Compliance was rewarded with slight privileges, disobedience with pain or humiliation. Hygiene at school was minimal. Students often shared bedding, towels, and clothing. Baths were infrequent, and lice were considered almost a natural part of education. You could scrub until your knuckles bled, but the little creatures always returned. The irony was rich. Children were taught cleanliness as part of moral instruction, yet subjected to conditions that made staying clean nearly impossible. Moral lessons were intertwined with physical endurance, mental discipline, and constant vigilance. Punishment didn't stop at the classroom door. Dormitories were extensions of the school, often under the supervision of matrons or older students. Misbehavior could be punished at any time, and sleep was regimented. Early rising was mandatory, and any delay might result in additional labor cleaning floors, fetching water, or polishing woodwork. The concept of leisure or spontaneous relaxation was essentially non-existent. Despite the grim reality, children did adapt. Many developed clever coping mechanisms, whispering secret jokes under desks, trading minor privileges for small treats, and learning to endure pain and monotony with a stiff upper lip. Social hierarchies developed among students. The clever, obedient ones earned small privileges, while the less skilled endured harsher punishments. Peer pressure often kept children in line almost as effectively as the teachers themselves. One of the cruelest aspects of education was the unpredictability of punishment. You could master Latin conjugations perfectly, yet speak at the wrong moment, or fidget slightly, and find yourself at the mercy of the cane. Mistakes were less important than maintaining absolute composure. Imagine being graded not only on your knowledge, but on your ability to remain perfectly obedient while being silently judged by every adult in the room, every second of every day. Girls' education, though different, was no less rigorous in its own way. Lessons in embroidery, etiquette, and domestic management were precise and unforgiving. A crooked stitch, an improper posture, or a mispronounced greeting could lead to scolding or isolation. Grace was everything. Even play was often turned into a lesson in proper conduct. A game was not a game. It was a test of patience, focus, and decorum. Boarding schools, especially for boys, were notorious for harsh discipline. Corporal punishment was a daily reality. Caning, standing for hours, even minor physical exercises that bordered on torment. The idea was to mold boys into men who could endure suffering, suppress emotions, and survive the unforgiving world of adulthood. Girls learned embroidery, etiquette, and how to faint gracefully. Boys learned Latin and how to tolerate cruelty. Meals were equally regimented. Gruel for breakfast, bread for lunch, perhaps watered-down broth for dinner. Consumption was monitored. Talking during meals? Punishable. Complaining about taste? Punishable. Swallowing slowly? You better do it silently. Nutrition was secondary to moral training. Hunger, discomfort, and endurance were woven into the daily fabric of education. And yet, despite all the strictness, children found ways to survive. Friendships, secret exchanges of small treats, whispered stories, and shared laughter were their quiet rebellions. Even within the rigid structures of education, humanity persisted. Children adapted to survive, developing resilience, cunning, and a sense of humor that would carry them into adulthood. In short, education in the 1700s was a brutal, highly structured, and morally loaded experience. Children were expected to obey without question, endure without complaint, and absorb knowledge alongside a generous dose of pain and humiliation. Yet through it all, they learned to navigate a world that demanded resilience, discipline, and ingenuity. And yes, the mental images of those classrooms, dormitories, and lecture halls are as grim as they are fascinating. Girls learned embroidery, etiquette, and how to faint gracefully. Boys learned Latin and how to tolerate cruelty. And somehow, the children survived, adapted, and carried on the legacy of endurance into the modern era. Perhaps with a slightly warped sense of humor about education. Imagine being a child in the 1700s, not just any child, but one expected to behave like a miniature adult from the moment you could walk and grunt coherently. And no, this wasn't just about looking responsible. It was about being responsible all the time. In every thought, every word, and every movement. Childhood, as we know it, forget it. Gone. Out the window. Instead, Kids were treated like tiny adults in training, constantly under scrutiny, constantly measured against some invisible scale of behavior and productivity. So, what did this look like in practice? Imagine waking up to a room where every adult's gaze seems to pierce your very soul. Your breakfast, probably a bland bowl of gruel or watery porridge, is silently monitored. Eat too slowly? That's a flaw in character. Ask a question? You better have the perfect answer or risk judgment. Express curiosity or joy. Well, depending on your parent's mood, you might also earn a rap on the knuckles, a sharp rebuke, or a scolding that sticks with you long after your stomach is empty. Children were expected to grow up fast, partly because economic realities demanded it. Families relied on every member to contribute to the household, whether by tending younger siblings, working in the fields, helping with domestic chores, or simply learning to behave in a way that reflected the family's social status. Childhood was not about play, discovery, or laughter. It was about survival, utility, and moral training. And moral training often meant hardening the soul, suppressing emotion, and enduring discomfort without complaint. Let's talk about the mental toll. Every move, every word, every sigh had the potential to be judged. Loud emotions were dangerous. Happiness, anger, sadness, even the excitement of discovering a worm in the garden was carefully monitored. Express too much, and you were seen as unruly. Express too little, and you were a dull, apathetic child. There was no winning. The subtle, constant expectation to perform as a tiny adult created stress, anxiety, and a profound sense of inadequacy in many children. Parents and educators believed that emotional repression was necessary to cultivate discipline, obedience, and moral character. They thought children who expressed their emotions freely were weak, selfish, or unfit to function in society. Boys must learn to control their impulses. Girls must learn to control their words, they said, often while standing over a child with a wooden paddle or stern glare. And yes, it's exactly as horrifying as it sounds. Being seen but not heard wasn't just a phrase, it was law. Your loud thoughts could earn you a paddle in the face, figuratively or literally. Discipline and emotional repression were everywhere. Home, school, even at church. Parents and teachers used a combination of surveillance, punishment, and expectation to teach children that feelings were secondary to duty. Crying, shameful, laughing too loudly, obscene. A moment of hesitation or doubt, proof of moral weakness. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was the cultural norm. And as absurd as it sounds now, the children internalized it as the right way to behave. Practical consequences. Constant surveillance led to kids becoming expert at hiding their true feelings. Smiles were measured. Laughter was calculated. Fear, sadness, or anxiety had to be suppressed. If your little brother broke a vase, you didn't rush to comfort him. You froze, because attention meant blame. If you scraped your knee, you didn't cry. Tears were a sign of weakness. Even play became regimented. Games were allowed only if they were quiet, socially appropriate, and morally instructive. Spontaneity was dangerous. Let's consider adolescence. As children aged, the expectations increased. By the time you reached 10 or 11, you were expected to behave like a capable young adult. You helped care for siblings, assisted with household labor, and performed chores meticulously. Mistakes were punished, sometimes publicly, to reinforce lessons for others. Social embarrassment was a tool of discipline. Imagine cleaning the floors for hours, only to drop a bucket of water and receive a scolding in front of your older siblings. Humiliation was part of character building. Even emotional expression was scrutinized in academic settings. Schools used physical punishment for behavioral infractions and also enforced mental discipline. Boys were drilled in Latin and arithmetic while standing for hours if they mispronounced a verb. Girls practiced sewing or embroidery under the watchful eye of teachers, who often lashed out at even minor imperfections. Both sexes were taught that mastery of skill was inseparable from mastery of self-control, and emotional outbursts were interpreted as moral failings. One of the most insidious aspects of Victorian parenting was the use of guilt and shame as tools for control. Children were constantly reminded of what would happen if they failed morally or emotionally. Misbehavior wasn't just punished physically, it was punished by shaming the child, often verbally, sometimes socially. Do you want to make your mother disappointed? Or, how would the neighbors see you? Were phrases that haunted children's internal monologues. Fear of shame often caused more anxiety than fear of physical punishment itself. The impact on mental health cannot be overstated. Chronic repression of emotions often led to difficulty expressing feelings later in life. Anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem were common, yet, paradoxically, children also developed remarkable resilience. Surviving in an environment where every emotion had to be filtered and controlled required ingenuity, patience, and quiet rebellion. Secret games, whispered conversations, and small acts of defiance were the lifelines of emotional survival. And yes, despite the dark undertones, humor was found in the absurdity of it all. If only the children had the chance to laugh. Imagine a young boy forced to sit perfectly still for hours while the adults walked around silently judging his posture. Or a girl balancing a perfectly folded napkin while thinking, I could be out climbing trees, but instead I'm being morally trained to iron linens. Girls learned embroidery, etiquette, and how to faint gracefully. Boys learned Latin and how to tolerate cruelty. Family dynamics reinforced these lessons. Parents were not just disciplinarians. They were the moral overseers. Every gesture, every facial expression was scrutinized. Love and care were often expressed through the lens of control rather than affection. Praise was rare, and even kindness could be tinged with lessons. I gave you this treat not because I love you, but because you earned it by being obedient. Emotional warmth was conditional. The loss of innocence was stark. Free expression, spontaneous joy, and childhood curiosity were often sacrificed for the sake of producing morally upright, industrious adults. Play, imagination, and emotional experimentation, crucial for development, were tightly monitored and directed towards socially acceptable outcomes. As a result, children grew up quickly, carrying an awareness of societal expectations and personal accountability far beyond their years. Yet not every child was entirely crushed. Siblings, peers, and small moments of shared mischief became survival tools. A whispered joke, a secret glance, a hidden snack, all small rebellions against the omnipresent control of adults. These acts, though minor, were essential for maintaining a sense of self in a world designed to suppress individuality. Now imagine all this from the vantage of modern eyes. Children today have toys, games, comfort, and emotional support. Compare that to a child expected to tolerate hunger, discomfort, fear, and constant moral judgment. Being seen, but not heard, was mandatory, unless your loud thoughts got you a wooden paddle in the face. And yet somehow, these children adapted. They endured, they survived, and some even thrived under the pressures that would seem unimaginable today. The Victorian approach to parenting and emotional repression, for all its cruelty and absurdity, left a lasting legacy. It taught lessons about self-control, endurance, and social compliance. But it also created profound psychological scars, limited freedom of expression, and enforced conformity over creativity. Modern parenting, by contrast, emphasizes emotional intelligence, safety, and nurturing principles that would have seemed alien, even ridiculous, to children of the 1700s. In conclusion, the Victorian household was a training ground for the soul, where love was interlaced with fear, discipline with pain, and childhood was a brief, rigorously managed phase rather than a time of joy. Emotional repression was the norm, and yet, through grit, ingenuity, and the occasional whispered joke, children navigated this world, emerging not only as adults, but as survivors. So, you've made it through the previous sections. And now we arrive at the part where children stop being passive victims and start becoming little strategists, engineers of survival, in a world that considered play a dangerous luxury and joy, a potential moral failing. Welcome to the art of surviving childhood in the 1700s, a full contact, mental, emotional, and occasionally physical marathon where every day was a test of resilience, ingenuity, and sheer stubbornness. Picture this. You're 7, maybe 8, and your life consists of long hours of enforced obedience, bland food, and unspeakable punishments lurking at every turn. You have no toys, or if you do, they are a rare, carefully rationed indulgence. You've already learned that whining gets you nothing but an extra slap or a scolding that echoes for hours. Yet, somehow, children survived. Not only that, they thrived in small, subtle ways. How? By becoming clever, resourceful, and occasionally, just a little devious. The first lesson every child learned was simple: adapt or get flattened. Life was unpredictable. Parents wielded authority like a sword. Punishments were meted out for real or imagined infractions, and the household rules could change on a whim. Children developed mental toughness early. A scraped knee wasn't a reason to cry. It was a reason to assess how quickly you could hide the evidence before the matron noticed. A misstep at the table wasn't a moral failing. It was a problem-solving opportunity. Could you eat with one hand under the table while subtly scooping the remaining food with the other? This daily regimen of observation, adaptation, and stealth built resilience. Children became experts at reading the room, anticipating reactions, and modifying their behavior in real time. They learned patience, foresight, and a keen sense of cause and effect, often out of necessity. One false move could mean humiliation or pain. Clever moves meant survival, or at least a quiet, undetected victory. Imagine trying to take a sip of water without drawing attention, or sneaking an extra piece of bread when no adult was watching. Successes were celebrated quietly among siblings or friends. A wink, a shared nod, or a quick, triumphant bite. Failures, however, could result in public embarrassment, additional chores, or worse, a brush with the dreaded wooden paddle. Children quickly realized that mental agility could sometimes save them more effectively than physical strength. Play wasn't just play. It was strategy. In a world where every action was monitored, games became exercises in stealth, ingenuity, and rebellion. A game of marbles wasn't simply about skill. It was about hiding them in pockets without the matron noticing. A run through the garden wasn't just exercise. It was testing boundaries, gauging adult attentiveness, and practicing escape artistry. Secret games and mischief weren't just fun. They were survival mechanisms. Children invented signals, codes, and shared strategies. A whispered conversation in the corner, a hidden stash of figs, or a cleverly timed sneeze to distract an adult could make the difference between misery and minor victory. They became masters of timing, observation, and improvisation, often outperforming their overseers in the subtle arts of deception and discretion. Consider how children adapted during mealtime. They learned to eat quickly, hide stolen morsels, and exchange small treats with friends, all without detection. These exchanges were tiny acts of rebellion, yet crucial for mental and emotional survival. A smuggled piece of bread might not seem significant, but in the strict world of the 1700s, it was a lifeline. A small reminder that ingenuity could carve out personal space and comfort. Children didn't face this harsh environment alone. Peer networks became critical. Siblings, cousins, and neighborhood friends formed covert alliances, sharing knowledge, warning each other about punishments, and exchanging survival tips. A younger child might learn to avoid certain chores that historically led to punishments. An older child might teach an elaborate trick to steal a treat from under the watchful eye of an adult. These peer networks created a culture of subtle mentorship. Older children often acted as guardians, teaching survival skills, passing on secret knowledge about parental moods, the timing of beatings, and the safest ways to avoid embarrassment. Young apprentices in this school of real-world cunning learned social intelligence faster than they learned arithmetic or embroidery. In essence, childhood became a parallel education. One part societal instruction, one part spycraft, and one part psychological warfare. It wasn't all small schemes either. Teamwork was essential. Group projects, whether forced by parents or arising naturally, were exercises in collaboration under duress. When a family chore demanded cleaning the entire house in record time, Older children coordinated younger ones, like a covert operation. Everyone had a role. One distracted the matron, another swept without spilling, a third retrieved the errant dustpan before the parents noticed. Success meant survival. Failure meant humiliation, punishment, or worse. Survival required ingenuity. Children repurposed household objects, invented new forms of entertainment, and created makeshift solutions to the strict demands placed upon them. A worn-out shoe could double as a toy, a piece of string could become a catapult, a scrap of bread could be a bargaining chip with siblings. Resourcefulness wasn't optional, it was required. Even small acts of invention were celebrated internally. A child who figured out how to avoid the matron's notice while stealing an extra slice of bread was a hero in their own eyes. A clever method of escaping chores for 5 minutes of secret play was a triumph. These little victories, though invisible to adults, became the cornerstone of resilience, creativity, and survival. Humor became a vital coping mechanism. Children developed an inner commentary, a mental running joke to maintain sanity. While sitting through long, silent lessons or enduring corporal punishment, they imagined absurd consequences for their overseers, invented ridiculous backstories for every scolding, and turned misfortune into stories. Humor was an emotional buffer, a shield against the constant psychological pressure. For instance, a child might whisper to a friend, "I swear, the matron's eyes can see into your stomach. Eat too slow, and she knows every crumb you stole last week." These shared jokes reinforced peer bonds and provided a sense of control in an environment where adults dominated every aspect of life. Ultimately, survival in the 1700s wasn't just about physical endurance. It was a mental marathon, a test of patience, ingenuity, and emotional agility. Every day, children faced the risk of punishment, the stress of constant surveillance, and the loss of personal freedom. Those who navigated these challenges successfully emerged resilient, resourceful, and remarkably adaptable. The humorous truth is, if you made it to adulthood without being permanently scarred, physically or emotionally, you earned a medal, a trophy, perhaps even a small parade in the imaginary Olympics of endurance. If you survived to adulthood, congratulations, you earned a medal in the 18th century Olympics of endurance. And yes, that medal came with invisible applause from every child who had endured alongside you, every sibling who had shared in the secret games, and every friend who had survived the daily gauntlet of parenting ingenuity. Welcome to the part of childhood where life decided to add a second layer of misery on top of all the misery you were already surviving. Yes, just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, society said. Hold my paddle and introduce the delightful combo of gender and class distinctions. In the 1700s, your experience as a child depended heavily, not just on how tough your parents were, but also on whether you were a boy or a girl, and whether your family had enough coins to keep you in fancy clothes instead of patched-up rags. Let's start with gender. Boys and girls were raised under very different expectations. Boys were seen as future breadwinners, warriors, and heads of households. Their upbringing focused on practical skills, endurance, and obedience. From an early age, boys were expected to handle chores, participate in apprenticeship programs, and learn the fundamentals of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but with a strong emphasis on discipline and respect for hierarchy. You're not just a boy, parents seem to say. You're a tiny adult in training, and every mistake could cost you your future career, or at least a solid spanking. Boys spent hours observing, copying, and laboring alongside their fathers or older brothers. If you thought your chores were bad today, imagine being 8 and tasked with fetching water, minding livestock, or carrying a half bushel of firewood across cobblestones, all while your parents scrutinized your posture and expression for signs of moral weakness. Girls, in contrast, were socialized for domesticity, grace, and obedience. Their training revolved around household chores, needlework, embroidery, and memorization of etiquette that could rival modern-day royal protocols. Every hand-stitch, every folded sheet, every curtsy was scrutinized, as though failing to maintain decorum would somehow invoke divine displeasure. Girls were prepared to manage a household, serve a husband, and, if they were lucky, supervise servants, because apparently, Survival meant learning subservience at a tender age. Humorously, one might say, girls learned embroidery, etiquette, and how to faint gracefully. Boys learned Latin and how to tolerate cruelty. And yes, fainting was considered a highly useful skill for a young lady in the 1700 second world, particularly if someone mentioned chores, a lecture, or the mere idea of outdoor labor. Now, add class to the mix. Children were not just small adults. They were stratified based on the wealth of their family. A wealthy child lived in a world of lessons, tutors, and moral expectation, while a poor child's day consisted of survival, labor, and punishment that was as likely to be physical as it was moral. For rich children, discipline came in the form of etiquette lessons, supervised reading, and social drills. Miss a step in a dance, fail to pronounce a single Latin word correctly, or misplace your napkin during supper, and the consequences were humiliation and moral correction, but rarely physical harm. These children were cushioned by their privilege. A cold bath? Probably lukewarm. A missed meal? Easily replaced with an extra slice of bread from the household pantry. Poor children, however, had no such luxury. Mistakes were met with physical punishment, extra chores, or public humiliation. Spilled water could mean scrubbing floors for hours. Late arrival to the communal table might result in a long lecture accompanied by a wooden implement to enforce compliance. A wealthy child might be punished with etiquette lessons, while a poor one got actual brickwork for character building. And yes, the bricks were real. They didn't magically get lighter because your family had fewer coins. Responsibilities also differed dramatically based on your social standing. Wealthy boys might study at home with a tutor or attend a boarding school where they endured rigid schedules and corporal discipline. But at least the food was semi-decent and the cold water only mildly shocking. Poor boys, on the other hand, were often working before they could tie their own shoes, helping parents in trades, herding animals, or apprenticing under a harsh master for meager sustenance. Mistakes meant physical punishment. Success meant slightly less hunger. Girls' responsibilities mirrored this divide. Rich girls focused on refinement, embroidery, needlepoint, music lessons, and the ability to entertain guests with grace. Poor girls labored from dawn till dusk, fetching water, cooking over smoky fires, tending younger siblings, washing clothes in freezing water, and performing endless repetitive chores designed to instill obedience and exhaustion. Their education came through observation and rote labor rather than tutors and fancy lessons. The combination of gender and class created a dual hierarchy: boys versus girls and rich versus poor. The ultimate survivor had to navigate not only the whims of adults and their strict punishments, but also the structural inequalities baked into every aspect of their lives. Education, or the lack thereof, amplified these disparities. Rich children had access to tutors, books, and sometimes travel for cultural exposure. They learned to read and write in multiple languages, studied arithmetic, and engaged in debates about morality, law, and philosophy. Their education, while strict, also allowed for critical thinking and social maneuvering, albeit in a very adult-directed framework. Poor children received rudimentary education at best. They might learn enough to tally sums, read signs, or memorize prayers, but most of their learning came from trial and error, direct observation, and forced labor. The mental gymnasium of literacy and numeracy was often replaced with the physical gymnasium of hauling water, chopping wood, and completing endless chores. Knowledge, in this context, became secondary to survival, compliance, and ingenuity. Another point of divergence was apprenticeships. For middle-class boys, apprenticeships offered training in crafts or trades, sometimes providing a route to social mobility. Yet these were structured under harsh discipline. A misaligned seam, a poorly carved spoon, or a missed delivery could trigger the wrath of a master, and punishments ranged from extra work to corporal correction. For poorer children, apprenticeships were often exploitative. They performed the hardest tasks, received minimal guidance, and were expected to contribute economically from day one. Girls might be apprenticed to laundresses or seamstresses, boys to carpenters, blacksmiths, or grocers. In all cases, work was central to childhood survival and success, or at least survival without injury. Children experienced these differences deeply. Rich children often faced pressure to meet moral and intellectual expectations, while poor children faced the double burden of labor and survival. Both suffered the consequences of strict surveillance, corporal punishment, and emotional repression. But the stakes were arguably higher for the poor, where failure could mean hunger, injury, or public humiliation. Gendered expectations compounded the challenge. Boys faced physical tests and preparation for a life outside the household. Girls were trained in emotional self-control, domestic mastery, and the art of obedience. The combination of adult expectations, social class, and gender roles produced a childhood that was at once physically exhausting, emotionally taxing, and socially stratified. Faced with these inequalities, children developed subtle strategies for survival. Humor was key, making jokes about authority, mimicking adults when unobserved, and creating small secret pleasures to relieve the monotony and fear of everyday life. Play became an act of rebellion, a game of marbles, a stolen moment of running outdoors, or whispering conspiracies with siblings or peers. Even poor children, despite exhaustion and heavy labor, found ways to navigate these structures. They learned to anticipate punishments, avoid the sharpest scrutiny of adults, and carve out small spaces for freedom and amusement. Observing the dynamics of household and neighborhood hierarchy became a crucial survival skill, as was learning to barter, negotiate, or mislead for small rewards, a stolen piece of bread, a brief rest, or a moment of laughter. And, yes, sometimes the absurdity of it all was inescapable. Imagine a wealthy child sitting in a drawing room, forced to memorize French conjugations while an industrious poor child balances a bucket of water and a firewood bundle across slippery floors. One receives etiquette lessons, the other, endurance training. The inequality is stark, but both are learning survival, just in very different ways. A wealthy child might be punished with etiquette lessons, while a poor one got actual brickwork for character building. And in both cases, childhood was less about innocence and play and more about endurance, ingenuity, and learning how to exist in a world that had very little tolerance for childishness. All right, now that we've covered the daily grind, the inequalities, and the brutal educational regimens, it's time to dive into the headline-making disasters of 18th century parenting. This is the part where history reminds us that humans have always had a knack for combining ingenuity with outright absurdity, sometimes with tragic results, sometimes darkly funny, and often both at the same time. Strap in, because this is where childhood becomes a roller coaster of baffling, brutal, and occasionally hilarious survival stories. Let's start with medicine, or what passed for it. If your child had a cough, teething pains, or was simply being inconvenient, your first thought wasn't a warm blanket or a cup of chamomile. Nope, you reached for whiskey, opium, or mercury ointments. Yes, mercury. The same stuff that today would get you banned from 5 continents for being slightly poisonous. Back then, it was basically considered healthcare with style. Infants were routinely given soothing syrups loaded with opium to help them sleep. Or, in some cases, to help parents sleep, while the infant screamed. Imagine handing your newborn a tiny dram of bourbon or laudanum, because apparently, screaming was a moral failing rather than a biological necessity. Ever heard of children being fed beer to sleep through teething? Yep, that was considered responsible parenting. And don't think it was occasional indulgence. This was daily, institutionalized, and socially sanctioned. One record from an 18th century London household recounts a nurse being praised for getting an infant to sleep for 6 consecutive hours, not by lullabies or swaddling, but by administering a dose of soothing syrup laced with opium. The parents nodded approvingly, never considering the long-term neurological consequences. Today, we'd call that a prescription for disaster. Back then, it was just good housekeeping. Beyond the medicinal misadventures, the labor expectations for children were equally absurd. Children as young as 5 or 6 were assigned tasks that would exhaust an adult: hauling water, collecting firewood, cleaning kitchens, or caring for younger siblings. Family survival often depended on the labor of the youngest members, because in a household without modern conveniences, every hand mattered. One infamous case tells of a 7-year-old apprenticed to a blacksmith. The child's job? Hold hot iron rods while the master hammered them into shape. He survived, barely, but not without receiving multiple burns, bruises, and the kind of existential trauma that would make a modern-day child psychologist faint. Meanwhile, siblings back home were learning to sew entire garments by hand to contribute to the household income. Childhood, clearly, was not for the faint-hearted. Now, let's talk about discipline. If you think your kid's timeout chair was harsh, just imagine the 18th century alternative. Wooden paddles, belts, birch rods, and even literal stocks or corner standing were considered reasonable methods to instill obedience. One well-documented case describes a child punished for spilling a cup of milk by being forced to kneel on split logs for 2 hours, while the household observed silently. No explanation, no comforting words, just silent judgment and occasional grunts of character building. Another account details a young girl who accidentally misthreaded a needle in her embroidery lessons and was sent to stand in the corner with a heavy book balanced on her head for an entire afternoon. No exaggeration. The book remained until her fingers were blistered, her back sore, and her pride utterly crushed. And if you thought public humiliation was reserved for adults, think again. Children could be paraded before the household, scolded for improper moral conduct, or punished in ways designed as social lessons, kneeling in front of guests, reciting long apologies, or performing chores under the direct supervision of the master of the house. The combination of unsafe health practices, extreme labor, and harsh discipline naturally had consequences. Mortality rates for children were shockingly high. According to historical records, as many as 40% of children under 10 died from disease, malnutrition, or accidents. And some of those accidents were directly linked to well-intentioned but completely misguided care from parents. Take bloodletting, for example. When a child had a fever, parents often assumed it was due to excess humors and would let blood with no anesthesia, no antiseptic, and no real knowledge of the child's condition. Combine that with opium-laced syrups, rudimentary hygiene, and occasional exposure to toxic substances like mercury or lead paint, and you have what could be described as a perfect storm of parenting disasters. One diarist recounts the tragic story of a child whose teething necklace, designed to ward off evil spirits, choked them while a parent slept. Another anecdote mentions infants who were accidentally poisoned by a caretaker confusing medicinal tinctures with drinkable liquids. It's a reminder that in the 18th century, parenting was less a science and more a brave gamble with tiny human lives. It wasn't just medicine and discipline, religion and superstition played a central role. Many parents believed that children were prone to demonic possession or divine testing. Crying, tantrums, or even minor illnesses were sometimes attributed to moral failings or spiritual imbalance. This led to bizarre interventions. Vinegar baths to cleanse the soul, charms around the neck to protect the spirit, and prayers repeated dozens of times per day to ensure the child's survival. Imagine a household where the morning routine involved dressing a baby, chanting incantations, applying herbal ointments, and ensuring the child had ingested a shot of something mildly poisonous all before breakfast. It's not surprising that childhood was considered a trial of endurance rather than a time for play. Let's pause for some infamous examples of parenting gone wrong. In rural England, a family decided that forcing their children to sleep outdoors in winter without blankets would harden their constitution. Several fell ill with hypothermia, though the parents declared it natural resilience training. A wealthy London household believed that administering daily doses of alcohol to infants would build stamina. Historical records suggest that a few survived long enough to display remarkable tolerance to spirits. But at what cost to their neurological development? In urban workhouses, children were fed thin gruel, walked miles to work, and beaten for minor infractions. Accounts describe children who fainted from exhaustion yet were returned to labor with barely a pause. Humor meets horror when you consider that for all these cases, parents were considered competent and loving. The cultural lens was different. Hardship was equated with character building, suffering with virtue. Today, we might call it negligence. Then, it was prudent parenting. And yes, in the midst of all this, you can't ignore the absurdity. Picture this. A parent hands you a shot of bourbon for teething, ties a garlic necklace around your neck to protect you from disease, and sends you off to fetch firewood in the snow. You're 8, shivering, sticky, slightly intoxicated, and probably wondering if the gods are laughing. If you think giving your kid a lollipop is risky, try handing over bourbon and opium syrup for science. And yes, that was considered responsible parenting, with no irony whatsoever. All right, so here we are, sitting back after a long, exhausting journey through the trials, tribulations, and downright absurdities of 18th century parenting. Take a deep breath. Maybe stretch your stiff fingers from all that imagining of wooden paddles, bourbon syrups, and endless bowls of tasteless gruel. If nothing else, you've just survived a mental boot camp for time travelers, complete with phantom spankings and ghostly echoes of parents who thought emotional repression was the height of love. Let's pause for a second and reflect. Parenting, as we know it today, with its messy living rooms, bedtime stories, and occasional ice cream bribes, seems downright luxurious in comparison. Modern parents have cushions, car seats, pediatricians, and emojis at their disposal. Back then, your survival was often a matter of endurance, compliance, and occasional cunning. Children weren't seen as beings to nurture. They were small adults expected to perform, endure, and obey. Childhood wasn't a phase. It was an ongoing obstacle course designed to forge resilience through extreme adversity. And yes, sometimes it included whiskey for teething, vinegar baths for cleanliness, and mercurial ointments for good measure. One of the key lessons from our journey is just how much parenting has evolved, thankfully. Today, emotional support, positive reinforcement, nutrition, and safety are not optional extras. They're recognized as essentials. The contrast is stark. 18th century parents operated under the logic that pain builds character and misery breeds virtue. Now we understand that love, attention, and stability build resilience, confidence, and empathy. Modern childhood isn't perfect, far from it, but it's infinitely kinder than a world where a dropped spoon could earn a day in the corner and a side of moral judgment. Nutrition, in particular, highlights the dramatic shift. Children once subsisted on bland gruel, boiled oats, and rationed sweets, with rare treats reserved for special occasions or the whims of wealthy families. Sugar, honey, or even fresh bread could be luxury items, meaning children's caloric intake was often both insufficient and joyless. Today, while we may lament picky eaters, at least they're unlikely to be fed a daily dose of opium or bourbon as medicine. We have a whole arsenal of knowledge about vitamins, hygiene, and safe hydration, none of which involved teething necklaces or strengthening mercury ointments. Then there's the question of discipline and emotional development. We've already seen how children were subjected to strict, often brutal methods: enforced silence, corporal punishment, prolonged hours of immobility, and social humiliation. Psychological growth was considered secondary to obedience. Imagine sitting silently for hours while every adult silently judges your existence, all in the name of character building. Contrast that with today, where timeouts are temporary, words matter, and emotional expression is encouraged. Modern psychology recognizes that repression often leads to trauma, whereas the 18th century treated trauma as a training tool. Parents were wielding paddles in the name of virtue, and children were expected to emerge disciplined, but often at a mental cost we now recognize as serious. Of course, this isn't to say that all historical parenting was malicious. Many parents genuinely believed they were doing their best, operating under the scientific, cultural, and moral understanding of their time. Superstition, pseudoscience, and social pressure dictated their choices. A mother handing her infant a whiskey-laced syrup likely thought she was easing pain. A father enforcing hours of silence probably believed he was cultivating virtue. From a modern perspective, it's horrifying. From a historical perspective, it's a product of necessity, fear, and ignorance. And it serves as a stark reminder that what feels normal today may look absurd or cruel to future generations. Another reflection is the resilience of children themselves. Despite grueling routines, punishing diets, and bizarre medicinal practices, children adapted. They learned ingenuity, stealth, and social strategies to survive. They played quietly when they weren't supposed to, whispered secrets to siblings, and found joy in small acts of rebellion. Those who made it to adulthood were, in many ways, elite survivors, tempered by adversity, creative under duress, and quietly defiant. In a world where survival demanded ingenuity, children became masters of mischief and miniature tacticians, finding ways to thrive even under the strictest regimes. Let's not forget the inequalities baked into childhood. Gender, class, and wealth dictated experience. Boys destined for apprenticeships or boarding schools endured academic rigor, physical discipline, and early separation from family. Girls faced domestic training, moral instruction, and a socially mandated innocence that often disguised harsh physical demands. Rich children might be punished with etiquette lessons or philosophical readings, while poor children were sent into brickwork or manual labor as a lesson in virtue. The inequities were profound, and yet they shaped the trajectory of entire lives. Modern parenting, with its emphasis on universal rights, schooling, and balanced nutrition, is almost unrecognizable by comparison. Now, a humorous note, because we've walked through enough misery to merit a laugh. Imagine handing a baby a shot of bourbon, then sending them to fetch firewood in freezing weather, all while expecting the child to maintain perfect moral comportment. Absurd, right? That was considered normal. Or picture a wealthy child meticulously practicing embroidery and etiquette while the poor neighbor's child is hauling bricks in the cold. A wealthy child might be punished with etiquette lessons, while a poor one got actual brickwork for character building. History, it seems, was equal parts tragedy and dark comedy. So what's the takeaway from all of this? First, modern parents have it much easier than anyone from the 18th century could imagine. Every time you soothe a fussy toddler with a bedtime story, give a child a healthy snack, or allow them a safe, supervised playtime, you're participating in an evolution of childhood care that took centuries of trial, error, and frankly, some horrifying misadventures to achieve. Second, we can laugh, but also marvel at the resourcefulness and resilience of children who survived under these conditions. Finally, history reminds us to appreciate the lessons of the past, not just for their entertainment value, but for what they teach about humanity, progress, and the ongoing importance of empathy and knowledge in parenting. Before we wrap up, let's imagine a hypothetical time travel scenario. You take a modern child and drop them into a household from this era. No toys, no comfort, no sweet treats, constant oversight, and a diet that resembles cement more than food. Would your child survive? Possibly. Would they emerge traumatized, crafty, or both? Almost certainly. And yet, those who did survive learned lessons we rarely teach today. Resilience, adaptability, and cleverness under pressure. In a way, the 18th century raised children like tiny, alcohol-scented, mildly traumatized superheroes minus the capes, plus a lot of vinegar baths. The history of 18th century parenting is an extreme mirror for our modern practices. It's grotesque, it's hilarious, and it's utterly fascinating. It reminds us that children are remarkably adaptive, that parenting is as much cultural as it is biological, and that progress like making it through a gruel-laden breakfast is hard-won and ongoing. The next time you hand your child an ice cream cone instead of gruel, a warm bath instead of vinegar, or let them play without counting every squeak or tumble, savor the moment. You're participating in a long arc of human progress, stretching back through centuries of absurd, darkly humorous, and sometimes horrifying parenting experiments. And remember, history may be sticky, harsh, and occasionally alcohol-infused, but it is full of lessons, laughter, and a deep appreciation for modern comforts. So, take a moment to reflect, chuckle at past absurdities, and, of course, subscribe to explore more strange, darkly funny, and often eye-opening corners of history.